Okay, so everyone's heard the objective, and what I'm going to do here in this talk is to try to summarize what are the goals that we started with and give you a sense of what is the approach that we have discovered of, I guess, 1.5 to 2 year journey of thinking about this. Prior to this, we, as a team of economists who have been interested in the law as a fundamental part of making economic transactions happen, we have always worried about the role of the adjudicator, because the one thing that when you work in finance in India, you come to a realization is that you strip everything down to the bare bones, and at the end of everything, there is a contract. And if that contract is to perform well, then all the provisions of the contract must work well. And if anything goes wrong in terms of the two people who signed that contract failing to make good their sense of it, then there has to be a forum where, if you refuse to sit down like grown-ups and resolve it between yourselves, there needs to be an adjudicating forum where you get that decision settled. And the one thing that we always thought is that, at the core of a lot of the problems that we are seeing, at least in the financial markets and transactions not happening well, that there is a problem with contract enforcement. And I guess that's the obsession with which we entered into this journey, which will show up in some of the choices that we've made as we flesh out the uh, the vision that we started this entire thing with, which was that let's see whether we can put together a bunch of metrics to see whether the courts are performing well. And if that actually works out nicely, right, coming up with metrics that all of us can agree are sound metrics, then it can help us think about different courts, think about where the courts are working well, where those courts might be broken, and then that could be a perfect leading light to try to give us a view on what is it that we need to do to make this entire thing work better. So, and rapidly we came up with a conclusion when we were thinking about the work. The work that we did was to understand the role of NCLT, that's the National Companies Law Tribunal, although I guess in this forum I don't have to say that. The NCLT, in its role as the adjudicator for cases that were coming up under the IBC, that's Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. And we did some metrics, and we weren't sure whether we'd got the heart of it, because the sense was that these are metrics that seem to matter for not for the people who are bringing the cases to court, but for the people who are running the court itself. And it seemed to be a problem, right? Because I think, like Ajay and Sachin alluded to, judicial functions are something that are consumed by somebody. And if you want to make sure that it's working well, then the users of that function need to agree that it's working well. And so we said, look, all through our discussions in the policy space on how to fix the judicial system, uh, the sense was all the metrics are pendency, disposal rates, but really, does a litigant who's bringing the matter to court care about this stuff? Which is why I think between Bhargavi and me, when we were first fighting about what should this project be, and then we had discussions with Supriya and Sachin, the idea was, look, let's think about how to think about the performance of a court from a litigant's point of view. And that's where this journey started. And I think that we got a lot of traction because people said, yeah, it's a useful thing to do, and let's take it forward. Okay, so here's our problem statement, right? Which is effectively saying that when you look at legal systems research that has happened in India so far, like by and large, the focus on coming up with a quantitative measure of whether the legal system is working well or not is you typically see pendency and disposal rates that are bandied about all the time. So you worry about how to build better courts so that the pendency comes down. How do you build up the bench strength so that pendency comes down, right? So that is the primary thing. But we think about it a little deeply, and these measures are for the workload of a court. So this looks like measures by the court for the court. But it's not about the users of the court. It's not about the users of the judicial system. And so that's what we said we should worry about. So litigants are equally a part of the legal system. They have to make these critical decisions, right? When I'm in a spot of a dispute between with someone who I've signed a contract with, or I'm in a transaction with, the first and fundamental question is, should I sue or should I not sue? How do we make that decision, right? Very often you say, okay, this person is just not talking to me. But even that very question comes down to saying, what kind of conversations are you willing to open up with that person? So there's a trade-off, right? You can sue and you will incur some kinds of costs. You may not sue, which is sit down and have a really good discussion with your counterparty. But there are costs to that as well. And the question is, how do you make that decision between going to court, that is to sue, and not going to court, which is probably to settle? But there are costs involved. So we as economists like this phrase, which is called the opportunity cost. So when you do something, you're incurring some costs. But the thing that most people do not quite think about is that, look, if I'd done the other thing, that is what I'm giving up, and there's a cost to having given that up. So the opportunity cost of settlement is also predicated on the fact that I'm giving up a certain amount of money. So if my dispute is about 100 crores, then if I go down one path, which is the court case, how much am I going to get out of it? Like true economic benefit out of having gone to the court. Out of 100 crores, how much do I get? Versus if I really spend a lot of time, think about negotiating with the person on the other side of the table, how much do I get? So both of these have to come up with. And if you ask yourself around the room, how do people come up with this number? And you say, okay, fine, let's look at other cases like ours. Let's look at other matters that have been resolved, or, okay, the only thing that we can see are things that are resolved in court. We can't see the counterfactual. So there's this huge vacuum in which we are all being asked to make these decisions, and that's the problem, right? So what is the opportunity cost of settling is not something that we can really see. And finally, if we say, okay, fine, we are going to sue, the question is where? Because very often you may have choices about different fora, and there is a genuine question when you go to one fora or the other, can you go there? Is it something that you can do? What is the cost of going to one versus the other? All the way to the details of who are the lawyers that I need to talk to be able to present my case favorably in front of a judge. And it's a whole process, like, do I get a quick fulfillment, or am I expected to go on for a very long time? When I go on for a very long time, every single time that I go forward, is it going to be the case that I see the same judge? Are there going to be different people that I need to persuade? How is that persuasion going to how is that persuasion going to work? So in a lot of the work that we as economists think now about systems, the big awareness that we have is every system is not something like a black box. There are people in it that's making the system work. And so the incentives of the people matter. And so we need to think about all of those things when we take a decision. Do I sue? Do I not sue? Okay. The problem is that at present, there is no visibility on any kind of measure that can help us answer these questions, even soft stuff, right? So when I say measures, I mean it could be all kinds of information. A lot of the time, we focus on making it quantitative. That is, there is a number that you can look at. A number in isolation is not very useful. A bunch of numbers is useful because then you can say, okay, A is greater than B, and then take it forward. But there can also be qualitative measures, right? And so when we started looking at what's a space in terms of thinking about a litigant-specific or a litigant-centric way of looking at how a court is performing, so that the litigant is the one that walks out saying, I understand how to deal with this beast, the court. There are elements that you have to think about, and it's not just a number. So there are some soft measures that you think about when you think about court performance. Before we go into thinking about the framework or the set of measures, we must recognize that when you have no such measure that helps the litigant think about it in a systematic, standardized way, right? So it shouldn't be the case that Geetika comes up with the same problem as me, but she comes up with a sense of a very different opportunity cost set or trade-offs of taking the case to court versus not, if our matters are similar to each other. Okay, that's the ideal situation. And so when you do not have these measures that a litigant can understand with which to answer the questions that she has, should I sue, should I not sue, should I settle if I'm getting a certain amount of money, where do I go with my suit, it reduces the quality of the decision that she takes. Okay, so without these litigant-centric measures, if you just give them pendency, there is no way that a litigant can take a decision of the three questions that we posed at the very start here. And of course, it hampers the accountability and the decision-making of courts itself, because people are coming to them with all kinds of matters. And the question is the judge's time or the bench's time being usefully and optimally used for making that decision or helping that litigant make the decision? when you have reduced decision-making quality by the litigants, that is, a person is just taking the matter and she doesn't have any idea of what are the alternative ways that she can resolve her dispute, or think about what are the costs of starting the dispute, we think that that's an inefficient decision that the litigant ends up making. And so when that happens, obviously one immediate outcome that we can think about is people are just randomly taking all kinds of matters to court, whereas it could have been so much more efficient for them either to have a genuine discussion with the person on the other side or just even drop the matter, because they end up being in a whole morass of a process which the court demands that they hadn't really realized when they started the process, right? So sometimes saying, okay, I give up on the amount of money that is under dispute is efficient compared with the kind of costs and time that you incur when you go to court. And that is something that we want to be able to put our finger on. So when you have poor decision making by litigants, you have a lot of cases going to court. That increases the workload in your courts. When there's a huge workload in the court, the rate at which the court can deal with these matters is going to be low. And then you go into this vicious spiral. When you have all of the courts stuck in all kinds of matters, then there are going to be a lot of economic inefficiencies, like problems with contract enforcement. Sometimes it's just that it should be a very simple matter resolving the contract dispute, but there are so many other problems sitting before the court, and the court is stuck, contracts are stuck, the economy is stuck. And so whenever you think about starting any kind of business or doing any operation in India, because of this problem of poor decision making by the litigant that starts this avalanche of all kinds of problems in the system, you end up saying, India, poor country, as a place to do business. Right? So this is really fundamental. You think it's a small pebble that you're not allowing litigants, or litigants cannot take these decisions optimally, but it has huge economic consequences. Okay, so now that we're all convinced that this is the most important thing that we have to solve for India and the world, because India is a big part of the world, what is it that we should think about when we think about measures for court performance, right? And uh, Bhargavi and Pavitra have done a huge scan of all the literature all across the world, including India. And there are these buckets, as Bhargavi likes to say, which are the performance of courts, right? And there are 5 big sets. First is one is independence, the second is efficiency, the third is effectiveness, the fourth is predictability, the fifth is accessibility, right? And if you look at these sets, what we have in the last column is, how do you think about operationalizing the bucket of independence or the bucket of accessibility, right? So read that table like that. So when you think about the metric, you have procedural fairness and distributive fairness under independence. That when a litigant approaches the court, she's convinced or she's not convinced that her her case is going to be decided on the merits of the matter, or there's something else to it. Efficiency is what I think everybody is aware of, right? What's the workload of the court? How much time does it take to dispose? These are things that we are used to talking about. Perhaps not so much timeliness, but certainly workload. Effectiveness is enforceability, that once you do get an award in the court, are you able to take that award and turn it into a result for you in as quick a time as possible? Predictability, is this outcome uncertain, right? That when you go into court, when is it that you're going to get the first hearing? When are you going to get a disposal, right? How do you, and this is not about the outcome itself. Both of you are going into court with your own side of the story. The question is, how certain are you about walking away saying that it's going to happen and it's going to happen reasonably quickly? Can you figure out what the process is? Can you predict that, so that at least from the point of view of your planning, you know what it is that you have to incur when you go into the court? So it's not about the outcome itself, it's about the process of achieving that outcome. If you're not happy with it, that's not the problem here, right? It's that you are getting an outcome, it's been fairly decided, and then what you do with it is your problem. That's what is predictability, that you don't have to stand around thinking, oh, is it going to take 15 years or it's going to take 105, right? And sometimes the Indian courts can actually deliver that kind of ridiculous timelines. So in that, we put certainty of outcomes and hearing date certainty, because The judge has to hear you, and that's what this is about. And the fifth one, or the last one, is accessibility, which is it affordable? Is it convenient, right? Do you have to jump through hoops to get this thing done? I said, we are used to measuring efficiency of court. The question is, what about the other elements? So here's where we think about pathways of measurement, right? Which is that if you think about the other elements, which is independence, effectiveness, predictability, and accessibility, or what is it that we have to stand on to come up with measures for the litigant? Remember, the litigant is the core target audience for us here. So what is nice is that compared with 10 years ago or 15 years ago, if you were doing research work on courts in India, the transparency of the courts has actually gone up. And I mean that in two ways, right? It's not just about the fact that the information is out there, but the information is out there and it's getting reliably updated. So you can actually build systems that are taking information and are able to give updated metrics. And this is something that is very important, because it's no point looking at the courts as of a given point in time and saying all our thinking, all our decision making has to be at that point in time. India is a country that's growing really fast. The courts grow with their country. And so you do need to get an updated sense of what these metrics are. So over the years, as I said, there have been an increase in the source of reliable information on how well courts are working or not. The first is something which a lot of you have used in your research work, which is the eCourts data set, which is daily data. That's information is at the daily level, the daily case level, but it's irregularly updated. So very often you find that if you go and touch that data set for the latest information, you can't find it. Sometimes it's from a long time ago. There is another one which is called the NJDG data. What does it stand for? National Judicial Data. Yes, great. Which is daily data. It gives you aggregates, though, of case types or at the age of the cases. High court websites are actually really good information about courts today, right? You can walk in, you can get cause lists of what are the matters that are listed for hearing, and you can actually see the outcomes in the sense of what are the hearings, what type of hearings. Tribunal websites are also similarly so, and both of these are very good for orders. Now that is about what we call public published transparent data, right? Which is you can touch it, you can pull it, you can do organization with it, and you can do calculations with it. But if you think back on our 5 buckets, some of those things are just not going to be captured by a court publishing court data, right? So independence is not something that we can put up there. Accessibility is also something that's difficult, because remember, her decisions are to sue or not to sue, but if she wants to sue, which forum does she go to, right? So you need to have these kind of metrics. Whatever metrics you're putting up, those metrics have to be available for all of the fora that she can go to. So it's not a matter of saying, okay, we can calculate one metric for one court, but a completely different metric for the other court, because then she can't compare. It has to be a like-to-like comparison if the litigant has to find it useful to make her decisions. So very often what we find is that even for a work that's done all across the world on putting together relative comparisons of courts, is that most of the times they do surveys of litigants. So these are perceptions of the litigants. It's not hard and fast like how many cases got filed at a particular point, but it's about the perception. So because of that, we think a little deeply about where we can get the data from. Certain kinds of performance elements. So think about affordability, right? You'd like to know what it is that what a particular matter is costs for the litigant when she goes to court. It would be great if we got transactional data to be able to do this. What do I mean by that? Law firms suddenly said, okay, fine, we'll just anonymize all the charges for all these particular matters and put it out for you. You can imagine everybody having a heart attack at the partner level and dying just now, right? Because that's confidential information. But it would help us for our case, right? Even if it is average cost for a particular matter at a particular size, it'd be just tremendous amount of information. This is not available. There are others which are metrics of procedural or distributive fairness, which is the independence, which can only be perception, right? Did you feel that you were treated fairly when you took the matter to court? So because of so much trouble on transactional data, litigant surveys tend to be the only source, and a good source if it is done, especially if you're planning to do it consistently. It would be great to have the same types of people or the same people being surveyed, but even if you can't, because panel data for perception surveys are going to be very difficult. But these could be good and useful for to measure independence or accessibility. In fact, these are the only ways to get it as of right now. And we see this all across the world. So what is our research program? Our project that Sachin at Agami very generously funded. Number one, identify what are the methods that we need to focus on if we want to capture the measurement or the performance of a court from the point of view of the litigant, right? What are those measures? What can we get? So we talked about some of the data sources, but from those data sources, what is it that we can pull out to be able to give the litigant a sense of how much it costs, or what is it that her trade-offs are? Once we identify the measures itself, then assess the ability to take standardized data like courts from court websites and then create standard metrics for, because as I said, we need to be able to compare performance. We cannot take one particular kind of metric from one court versus the other. It has to be the same. And the way that we calculate it has to be the same. If survey is the way to go, then we need to be able to design a survey instrument to calculate or put together metrics which are not available in published data space. And then finally come up with a sense of, look, if we understand that this is possible, right? A bunch of metrics from standardized data, from court websites, and a bunch of metrics from survey data. How do we come up with something that can be published on an updated basis? Because the country never stands still, processes don't stand still. So it has to be the case that if the litigant has to reliably use this information, it's got to be updated. And so that's our research program. So I'm going to give you an example, and then we can discuss, but really Pavitra has got the floor in terms of showing you exactly what we've been able to do with this entire effort. But here are some metrics from data on court websites that we think might inform some of the measures that we are looking at. Remember, it's independence, efficiency, effectiveness, predictability, and accessibility. We all agree that from the published court data website, we can put together the effectiveness, right? So you can look at workload. You can even figure out how quickly cases are getting disposed. The other one that we thought we had, the court website data gives us tremendous visibility on, is the predictability, right? How, when you walk into a particular court, and you will hear Pavitra talk about 3 different courts in Bombay on one particular matter, which happens to be the debt dispute resolution matter, you can actually calculate how effectively or how certainly you are able to get your first hearing in these 3 courts. So you get an expectation, right? If you walk into this court today as opposed to walking into another court, which can deal with the same matter because you happen to be a bank and you've got a debt dispute that you need resolved. When you walk into these 2 fora, what is your expectation of when it is that you can get a first hearing? Similarly, you can say, when is it that you can expect to get a second hearing? And of course, you can ask, when is it that you can expect to get a disposal? What we have done is we flipped it around and said, look, if you have time of or your attention span is about a year, and beyond a year you have to do all kinds of calculations. At least that's how I behave. I have to go and fundraise next year, right? Because I've got visibility this year, but not the next. In this year, what is my expectation? Can I get a hearing this year? Can I get disposed this year? Right? That's information that I can then use to calculate, okay, how much time or which forum do I get to go to? And so certainty of outcomes, hearing date certainty, these are things that if you read, or if we read the court data set clearly enough, what we can do is figure out for a particular case, what's the entire life cycle of the case. So we can identify the case when it was first filed, it got admitted, it got heard the second time, then it got disposed. And similarly, we can do it for a bunch of other hearings. And then you accumulate the whole thing and say, okay, what is the pattern in this court versus another court in which similar matters are being filed? Okay, so you track a fixed case ID, you construct the life cycle of a case, and you can similarly do that for all the courts which are dealing with similar matters. And what you get is a prediction, is a measure of predictability and timelines, which is something that we haven't seen so far in a well-published manner. So we think that it's a real positive. Of course, I'll leave it for all of you to agree or disagree based on what Pavitra is going to do as her talk. And what I'd like to end it with is some discussions for some open-minded or open questions that we are facing with over and above what Pavitra is going to talk about. Right? So we thought about, look, in the court data which is published, do we have metrics for effectiveness, which is an order has come and it's the final thing, it's a closure for you. We know that appellate tribunals and courts also publish case data, right? So you can take a matter from a district court to a high court to the Supreme Court. But what we haven't done is track the case as it goes from court to court, right? Lower court to higher court. So where is it getting appealed? Now, this is not as simple as tracking a case through one court, right? Because once you get an ID, you can check the life cycle. We will then need to do a fairly lot of hard work to figure out that a case is closed, it's disposed, there's an order that it's a final order. But does it come back into the legal system? That's not something that we've done so far. If we are able to do that, then that gives us the tracer on the amount that a single court, like let's talk about Bombay High Court, how much of debt dispute resolution matters which get disposed come back up into the Supreme Court, right? Or at NCLT, if the matter is closed, how frequently does it come back into the NCLAT? So this is not something that we've done yet, but once we are able to do this, right, which is, I think, the next step of our journey, we should be able to come up with a measure of enforceability, right? Similarly, right? How do you come up with metrics for accessibility? How do you know that a court is accessible? So one way of doing this is to look at how informative a court's website is. So it's easy to think about a litigant who's already got a case admitted to a particular court. Does that court's website give that litigant visibility on where her matter is at any given point in time? Right? Can she look it up and find out, has it been posted for hearing? Once it's heard, what is the order? Can she access the orders from the website? Does she have to talk to a lawyer? Right? Because a lawyer is bloody expensive. The court website actually gives her visibility on the orders. That's useful for her. That's for litigants who are already litigants. The question is, to the core of our questions, right? Should I sue or not? Which forum? Then does the court website give information to citizens about their performance, right? And that's not something that we've done yet. This is a project that we thought about seriously. We didn't have the bandwidth. We are in discussion with Daksh on how we can operationalize this, but this is one more big and useful element of thinking about how accessible are the legal systems in the country. Then two other questions that we have struggled with as we've rolled out our project is, what are the project performance elements which are important but are not in this set, right? So we look around, we saw what the rest of the world is doing, and we think, broadly speaking, yeah, this makes sense. But other things that we should be thinking about, but we're not covering over here, right? One thing that we are very aware of is, to sue or not to sue, how many people do not sue? How many people do settle out of court? This is not something that we get to see, but it would be fantastic to be able to see. Right, so with Agami, once again, we've looked at some of the ODR, ADR data, and it seems to be tremendous in terms of how rapidly matters can get disposed of. What we do not know is does it hold equally for all size of matters, for all types of people? And then once they are settled in the dispute resolution fora, does it come back up again, right? So this entire question of enforceability and appeals is something that is a critical issue that we need to resolve. And at some point, we're going to get to do it, right? I have full faith. And of course, the bit of a technical question that we are facing now is, we've got one bunch of metrics that's coming from very hard established published data, which is from the courts. The other one is perceptions. How do we marry the two? So if a court works very well on saying a high scale or a high score on a perception, but a pathetic score on the quantitative measure of timeliness, whereas the other court is exactly the opposite. From the litigant's perspective, how do we look at it? How do we think about it? Now, you can come and say, it's the litigant's problem. We can't solve all of it, right? You can feed this information, and then it's her call as to where she wants to file her suit, if she wants to, or if she doesn't want to sue at all. But these are some open-ended questions. I'm sure these are not the only ones. Ajay keeps telling me, every time I think about your 5 buckets, I can think about 20 research questions that we should do. Or I say, great. Shall we also tell Agami this so that we can keep working on this forever? But I just wanted to lead you with a list of some of the papers that we've worked on in terms of looking at measuring various courts. I think that all of you will find it fascinating. We certainly do, and we hope to expand this list as we go forward. Thanks a lot.